Well, we've broken the 100 participants mark, and we're at 6:05. We were so busy talking about our last names and first names that we forgot that we were here for a panel session. So I would like to get it started and welcome all of you to our panel on payments modernization and open banking. What may sound as interesting as drying paint is actually more revolutionary than sliced bread, and we're going to try to convince you that for the next while. Now, I'm sure all of us in the panel and probably most of the listeners can tell you stories of hiking through the Himalayas with just an Apple Watch and a portable solar panel as a means of payment, or buying a baguette in the Pyrenees with a fingerprint in grade 3 French. I'm speaking of myself here with grade 3 French. Well, back at home, we need 3 pieces of identification, a long form birth certificate, 3 living grandparents to show up at the branch, just to cash a $100 check with an $80 hold. And so you guys can probably tell I'm a little traumatized by the Canadian experience. But jokes aside, at least for the first part, what is open banking and payments modernization? Well, I decided just to copy and paste the definition from the Government of Canada website. Now, I did a little bit of editorializing. What is open banking? Well, open banking is not yet available in Canada, but it is available in other countries like Australia, the UK. The Government of Canada is currently considering the best way to enable its safe introduction in Canada. It's a secure way for you to share your financial data with financial technology companies, often called fintech or fintech apps. When you use a fintech app with open banking, your bank securely shares your financial data with the app on your behalf. You do not need to provide your online banking username and password to access the app's products and services. It's sometimes also known as customer-directed banking or customer-led, but open banking is the term most widely used. Still not sure what it is? Well, great. We have 4 industry experts to walk us through the details. Now, let me introduce the panel in order of importance. First, we have Associate Professor of Finance, Ryan Reardon. Okay, no, that was me. So we won't do it in order of importance. We'll do it in the order that I have in front of me. So we have, and I'm glad that we actually practiced all of our names because now I can get them all right. First, we have Nick Catino, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Wise. Wise is a new kind of financial company for people and businesses that travel, probably not a lot right now, but hopefully soon, live and work internationally. He leads interactions with governments and crafts consumer engagement campaigns to raise awareness and influence policymakers, and does a lot of events like this. We have Eva Wong, who is a COM00, I guess we would say, co-founder and COM00 graduate at the Smith School of Business, co-founder and COO at Borrowell. Borrowell is a financial technology company dedicated to making financial stability possible for everyone. Borrowell offers free credit scores. I use them often, and I'm not just saying that. I check my free credit score often. Report monitoring and AI-driven financial product recommendations. With well over 1 million members, Borrowell is one of the largest consumer fintech companies in Canada. Eva is the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year winner in Ontario, named one of the standout 35 on the Global Women in Fintech Power list. She holds degrees from the Kennedy School at Harvard University and the Smith School of Business, as I already mentioned, and she's also on our advisory board. We have Senator Colin Deacon. When I first wrote this, I said he's an open banking hero in Canada. I hear he has another name, and it's the Beacon. Senator Deacon was appointed to represent Nova Scotia in the Senate of Canada in June 2018. A lifelong entrepreneur, he believes that we must build an inclusive economy, also extremely important if we want a more resilient economy. Recently, he's most focused on harnessing the digital economy, improving Canada's public and private sector competitiveness, and addressing climate change. And finally, in terms of the 4 panelists, we have Rob Patterson, President and CEO at Alterna Savings and Alterna Bank. He joined as President and CEO in 2013. He brings a fundamental focus on the consumer experience, a passion for fintech, and a global understanding of the financial services industry. He also sits on the advisory board of the University of Western Ontario, the Dean's Advisory Board of the Sprott School of Business, actually my alma mater, and the advisory board of Smith's new Masters of Financial Innovation and Technology program at Queen's. And I'll, at the very end, tell you a little bit about that. So without further ado, let me start the panel with a lobball question. And I consider it to be a lobball question, but we'll see. If data is the new oil, are Canadian banks the new dinosaurs? Rob, why don't you start? Introduce yourself and your organization if you want to, and let us know what you really think, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Look, I don't think the big banks are the new dinosaurs. They've been the old and loved dinosaurs for many years, right? The big banks, the oligopoly, have been pushing against innovation and preventing us joining the global economy. So, I think it's really important for Canadians to understand the big banks have been barriers to us joining the world. When you look at countries, Singapore, if you look at Hong Kong, I grew up in Hong Kong. I was able to do digital payments in the 80s. And I know probably most of the people on here were not even born then, but I could load and tap and go through transport, go to 7-Eleven and digitally pay with not ever having a bill in my wallet. I could wear a necklace around my neck, a bracelet on my arm to pay. So when you think back to Bell in Canada, remember when, for some of you, you remember phones, were in 2 colors, and when call waiting came up, that was incredible. But when we opened up and joined the world economy on telco, all of a sudden the acceleration of features and functions and capabilities. When you take a look at, I'll use Coho as an example. I met Dan 5 years ago for a coffee, and he had an idea. 5 years later, Dan runs, for all intents and purposes, a financial institution. It's a fintech, but it's a financial institution. It's 120,000 clients. You heard about Eva's company, right? And the growth that they've had. So, the big five are in the big towers, but the people and the movement is at street level, right? And, even ourselves as a humble financial institution, we're a credit union. We're 113 years old on the credit union side, but we started a digital bank 3-4 years ago. There's about 200 credit unions that are, under $1 billion. They've been around for 50 years, 75 years. Alterna Bank, is over $1 billion in 3 years. So it really shows you there is a movement. The question, though, I think we have is, can the government enable that movement, right? Can the government and the policymakers get on board to help with the acceptance of digital identity, to help with the acceptance of the new rules that the Bank of Canada has issued to allow fintechs to be able to do payments? Can we get a voice around that? And I'll, go to, our Senator Deacon the Beacon, sending that light out there. He's going to hate us for that nickname, but, how do we put a spotlight on it? Because the dinosaurs are big and they're kind of dying, but they're blocking the sunlight. And so we've got to figure out how to get focus and attention on it, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I think that was pass over to you, Senator Deacon, to maybe talk a little bit about your role and how regulation is going to help or hinder the future of financial services.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for that, Rob. No, that was a great summary. Look, we've got tremendous financial institutions in this country, but they haven't been embracing innovation in our economy. And I differ from where you opened this conversation a little bit based on conversations I've had over the last year. Data is not the new oil, it's the new uranium, because it's incredibly powerful, but it's also very dangerous. And you've got to handle it very carefully. And our banks have a lot of data on us that they're not using. So we're not getting the value out of that data, right, when it sits in our banks. And individuals, we found from the United States, studies done at the Philadelphia Fed, individuals who are deemed to be not creditworthy, in fact, are unbelievably, there's half of them are identified by the Philly Fed as being invisible prime borrowers based on alternative data being assessed in a different way. So from my standpoint, there's a really tremendous opportunity for consumers and Canadians in open banking. I'm a champion. You've got three experts on this panel and one champion. I believe in this deeply because it's necessary for Canada. Our financial system is either going to help catalyze growth in our economy or it's going to slow growth in our economy. And if we have a financial system that is increasingly more expensive in relative terms than the services available globally and doesn't have the breadth of services available globally, that's like a tax on our economy, on everything that happens in our economy. Checks being held for 2 weeks. I had purchased a service from Nova Scotia's Department of Transportation the other day. I could only pay with a certified check and a fax. I could fax the information over. I could not send my form digitally. I could not complete my form digitally. And I could not send this small amount of money any other way than through a certified check. That is the slowing down of our economy of every aspect by not embracing these new opportunities it's absolutely untenable as we emerge from COVID.
Great, thanks. I think that was a good lead-in for you, Nick, to talk a little bit about payments. How payments can work, how WISE is sort of pushing forward on this, and maybe help Senator Deakin get his I don't know if it's a driver's license or a license sticker, a little bit more digitally, and then we'll hand it over to Eva to give us her perspective from Borrowell. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Glad to be here and glad to follow Rob and Senator Deakin. And I agree with everything they said. I'm an optimist by nature. Change may be scary for some of the incumbents, but change is coming. And I actually believe there's an opportunity for them as well. And you see companies like us increasingly partnering with those banks or even old businesses who have never offered a solution for cross-border payments before, for example. And the UK, when the Competition Bureau mandated open banking, for example, some of the banks may not have liked it, but now a lot of them are committed to that change. And you see our integrations and partnerships with them. Those banks have viewed this as an opportunity. And so the government certainly has a role to play here. And when I think about payments modernization, it's not just open banking. I think of it in 4 planks. One is real-time payment rails. That's instant payments. That's coming next year. 2 is a modern payments charter. That was in the budget last month, so now that's on the way. And then this is where it gets a little trickier, though. 3 is expanding access to the payment rails. There's been consultations, but it's not in legislation yet. Hopefully it will be. And then 4, consumer-directed finance. Whether that requires legislation or not, I'm not sure. My hope is that with those first 2 on the way, real-time rails and a modern payments charter, we've started down that path towards modernization. We now need to keep the momentum going. And I am optimistic that it's going to happen. And I'm optimistic those incumbents will come along and view it as an opportunity as well. But that's why it's so important we have events like this and we raise the profile of these issues and we demonstrate clear support for them.
Great, thanks, Nick. Eva, as the CEO at a firm that's at the center of payments rails, lending, using the data, generating data, providing data for your customers to free. Why don't you give us your perspective on what's been going on thus far?
Yeah, I'll just clarify I'm the COO. My co-founder wouldn't like it if I mentioned that. But I think one of the things that's really interesting, Rob, is you sort of talked about the banks. Are the banks like friend or foe in this? And I do think that it's helpful if they're a foe in some ways, I think, to get consumers more riled up. I think that's what happened in the UK is like there were a lot of really terrible bank practices that people got up in arms about. And that's, I think, where the political will came. At the same time, I think like even when you were talking about the banks, I'm like, oh my goodness, this makes me a little uncomfortable. And someone once explained to me that like the Canadians' relationship with their bank is this like weird one where it's like we're strangely proud of them for surviving the 2008 financial crisis. There's like this weird thing, like no one loves the bank, but no one also like hates the bank. So I don't know. I think that's where I'm torn. And I think to Nick's point, it's like a lot of fintech companies partner with banks. So it is. It's like for sure they're I think putting up blockers to open banking, but I do think that banks as well can have a lot to gain from this. So I think that's the thing that like puzzles me a little bit is like, is it more helpful to cast the big banks as like enemies in order to galvanize people, or is it better to try and get the banks alongside? But maybe that's an impossible task. So I don't know if people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, further to your point about Canadians being oddly proud of their financial institutions, right before this, I was talking to my mother, and I was explaining in a 1 minute socially distanced, I was on the road, 1 minute session on what open banking is, and her first comment was, "But that's not going to make the banks less stable, is it? Because I really like a stable bank." And I said, "Well, you're going to have to tune in." So I guess I'd say, an open question out there. A, is it going to make banking less stable? But also, what are the impediments to in Canada? Why is it that there is some, there is political will, but there is also will from the individual customers to push it in the UK. But even in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, it wasn't just classic banking economies that push for something new. This is organic also in sort of all over the world. Why is it that I don't want to say we're lagging behind and being negative. I put a couple jokes into the start, but what's holding us back? Anyone? Open question, open answer.
I'll dive in. I think it's been it's been a challenging time. We had a finance minister who was not keen on the idea. He kicked the can down the road as far as he could, as often as he could. And for example, he had a report in June 2018, the same time the Senate came out with its report supporting open banking, from his advisory committee, saying that this is important. We need to be moving down this road. And he released it on a Friday and afternoon, late January, over 6 months later. In Ottawa, that's the way to get rid of a story, not to bring attention to it. And so there has been a lack of political will. But on the other side, we have a new finance minister who, within 2 months of coming into office, reprioritized that process and restarted very quickly the second round of consultations. They were excellent. I sat through every hour and really enjoyed the 15 hours of consultations on Zoom. They didn't get zoomed out. I thoroughly enjoyed that. But there's been a lack of understanding and a lack of political will. I believe that's changing. I think there is there's a growing understanding in Ottawa that this is central to our competitiveness. I think there's an understanding that it is great to have stable banks, but if our banks are increasingly losing their competitiveness relative to the global markets, that doesn't make them very stable. When their highest margin product lines are increasingly being eaten by digital competitors, that doesn't make them more stable. So we have to make sure that our banks are globally competitive. That's essential. We've got to make sure that consumers have access to the services that enable them to empower their lives. That's starting to be understood. We have to make sure that we have new entrants coming into every market in our economy to keep pushing innovation through the economy and rewarding innovators that are raising that risk capital and creating new opportunity. So those elements are now being more clearly understood in the public service and by political leaders. But we are missing, for example, the updating of our new privacy legislation. Bill C-11 is stalled in the House of Commons. I don't think it's going to make it through before Parliament rises in June. That's challenging because that at its core has data portability. And we need consumers to have the right to move their data from one organization to another, to have control over their data. We're getting single sports betting legislation. That made it through the House of Commons. To me, that's a challenge in terms of what's being prioritized politically. So we haven't had a political party calling for this issue, not one. But we at least are getting a growing understanding in Ottawa, and I'm really pleased about that. And I'm just hoping that our regulators will start having the conversations. I was concerned that I met with a number of the regulators in Atlantic Canada at a provincial level that regulate the credit unions, and they still had not had a conversation. OSFI had not initiated conversations with them about the move towards open banking. So it isn't a push, it isn't a priority yet in OSFI And if it isn't an OSFI, then it means that, that the move to operationalize a lot of these the necessary changes to facilitate move to consumer-directed finance are not underway. So we've got a long way to go, but there are signs. There are signs.
Great. Anyone else? Nick?
It strikes me that conventional wisdom on payments issues is to stay under the radar and push these things behind the scenes, but that's clearly changing, as Senator Deakin highlighted, and I think the benefits for consumers have been talked about ad nauseum within the payments industry, and people like Senator Deakin that are supportive. But now, the people on this, listening to this panel, for example, understanding that this will enable more control of their finances, consumer-driven business models. There's a pretty good story to tell. Last week, there was an excellent story in Beta Kit on the state of open banking. And I think there's increasingly more attention to this issue that ultimately helps give perhaps a political incentive as well. And maybe developing more supporters, more MPs that have an interest in this. And that's how we move it. And so the more of that, the better.
Just adding in, and I'll go back to kind of Eva, your question, before about the big banks and are they friend or foe and kind of embedded in here. I think it's a natural thing, right? They're large institutions. They have all access to the data. They're going to want to protect that base. And so the challenge, I think, is how do we make sure that it's a fair playing field for the innovation to come out in Canada, right? So it's that ability to enable someone like Dan with Coho, right, to come up with that idea, the Mogo, Neo, like where could they be if our legislation was more advanced? Where could they be if we had a more modern privacy framework, data security framework, right, data share framework? And how would that allow us to have innovation that could be global innovation? I always use Singapore in DBS, right? DBS, government-owned financial institution that is viewed as one of the best, embracing entities of open banking and digital capability. And why was that? Because they had aspirations that were much bigger than Singapore, right? They wanted to be a strong regional player. So they knew that open banking was something that they had to promote in order for their entities to have capability across all of Southeast Asia. And they've been doing incredibly well over the last few years in embracing it. When you look at Canada, for us to embrace that and to modernize our legislation at all levels for regulation of financial service and data privacy, the amount of new companies coming out of the Canadian landscape, the ability for us to retain, bright, creative people in this country, and for us to take our services on a global expansion becomes the art of the possible. What I worry about is with the legislation having been slower in the past and not being aggressively supported on all party basis, we have lost talent. We have lost jobs. We have lost innovation. And, I grew up around the world. I was born in Paris, France. I grew up in Hong Kong. I have worked pretty much in, any country you can think of. And Canadians, from a banking perspective, are not held up. If you go to Money 2020 in Europe, whenever we can eventually go back to Money 2020 in Europe, right? No one's leaping to be over with the Canadian, contingent to talk about innovation. And I honestly believe that if we accelerate this, with the things that Nick has talked about and Colin's talked about, sorry, Deacon's talked about, that we can still right-size that. And we can be more competitive. But the big five are going to, protect their territory, and they're going to protect, I often hear, my former colleagues, I've worked in the big five, I've worked in a global bank, JP Morgan, and they all often refer to it as their data, right? And it's not their data, it's our data as consumers. And the more that we can align that ownership and get there, we can do great things. And the Retail, Payments Activity Act, that, just went through the Bank of Canada is a huge step. It's a great step. And the more that we can educate Canadian consumers about what that's going to mean for them, how it's going to enable fintechs. And look, at Alterna Bank, I got to tell you, Alterna Savings, we love partnering with fintechs. We're a small financial institution. So, it's in our best interest to have more fintech growth and to have more innovation, because we're all going to share it. And fintechs are great at partnering. It's the oligopoly that's not so great at partnering, maybe short term, but often trying to learn in advance. So, I just believe we are on the cusp of a great opportunity, but we have to find our voices. And Senator Deakin has, I think, said in numerous remarks at different events, right? We need the movement to grow. And I think Nick was saying, very similar things.
Great. Eva, as a fintech innovator and entrepreneur, and someone who's a proponent of getting the data and making it available to everyone, what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm sure you've got lots of ideas about how to partner and what we're going to do with the data. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I do think that the more fintech innovation that happens, the more everyone in the ecosystem will benefit. I mean, I think we often talk about consumers, but you're right. I think Rob, to talk about how banks as well are going to benefit from some of that. And I do think it's about leveling the playing field. And I don't think anyone here believes that our financial innovation is going to come from the 5 big banks. So, I mean, at Borrowell, I think that we've sort of consciously pivoted our product strategy away from open banking, because we can't depend on that to happen for us to execute our product strategy, right? We've acquired a company. We're going to be building more of our own products, because we don't think that we will have access to other people's products in the same way that we'd like to be able to. We want to create this seamless user experience, which I think in other countries you can do by not building everything yourself. You can connect into other people's products in a way that's much more seamless. But there are so many barriers to doing that here in Canada. It really has shifted our approach, but it makes it harder. I mean, obviously to build everything on your own is a lot more effort than to be able to, just link into other people's products and services and data.
Great. I've got a question. I'm just going to throw it out there. So I think I'm relatively versed in financial things in fintech, but can anyone walk me through what would data portability look like for a customer? So not from the perspective of a bank, from a payments operator. If I was a customer and I wanted to avail myself of these new open data or open banking financial services, what would it look like for me as a customer?
I can tell you how I used it today, checking my own finances. Often it's talked about as linking financial accounts, right? Moving money from my bank to a Wise type company, a money transfer platform. I also have an aggregator where I can look at all my finances to see how I'm spending my money, trying to manage it more efficiently. And I also have my investments. Similarly, will show not just the investment manager, but the other accounts in that same dashboard. So I have a full financial picture of my money, of my assets. I'm making better decisions based on those recommendations I'm getting. It's tailored to my use case. And ultimately, going back to that first part, linking financial accounts, that's based on screen scraping right now. That's what's happening behind the scenes. In an open banking regime, I have more sense of security that I know my data is moving, not through screen scraping, but through directly integrated APIs. And really, it's just those financial institutions can talk to each other, and I can link all my financial accounts together. That's how I explain it to my mom, for example, who has no idea what any of that means. Well, she has a bunch of bank accounts, can't keep track of any of them, and I can see them all in one place.
And for me, what I'd offer is that Canadians are, for the most part, at the wrong end of a data vacuum as Canadian consumers. We're seeing our data go to somebody somewhere. We don't know what it's used for. Is it used for our benefit? Can we get it back? There's just so many questions around that. Where data portability would bring Canadian consumers the right to have control over who uses their data, for which purposes, for how long. And it's just as simple as that. And they start to get benefits for it. And I look at small business. I don't know a single small business person who got into small business to manage the administrative burden of running a small business. of making sure that they've got enough working capital and they don't spend or make an investment in something at the wrong time, and all of a sudden they're short for payroll 2 weeks later. Just all those things that they've got to manage. That can be done in an automated fashion. That's being done right now using platforms like Porwell and helping individuals plan their spending more effectively. But it can happen for our small business people so they can focus on what they're passionate about. They can focus on what they're really good at. And they don't have to have all this energy and weight and worry around the financial and administrative burden associated with running their business. So to me, it's about having control of your data to have your data working for you and providing you with an easier way to advance towards your goals.
Great. Now I know why we call you the beacon. I mean, you're shining the light in the right direction.
You don't need to keep that up.
Oh, the shtick's done now? Okay.
I was wondering what you thought of that nickname.
I think I'm in trouble for bringing that up earlier today, and I'm gonna have to leave Ottawa.
Yeah. To be honest, I didn't even get the connection between Deacon and Beacon until you mentioned it, Senator Deacon.
You're just keeping on going with this, aren't you? Right.
Okay, I'm gonna drop it. I'm gonna drop it now. I was having a conversation. It might have been yesterday, might have been today. That the days are sort of blurring together. About what you're talking about, Nick, about screen scraping, and then I don't know how we got to the topic. We were talking about Mint, right? Everyone sort of remembers Mint. And you sign up for it, and then all of a sudden you realize you had to give all of your, access to your account to a company that you're not quite sure where they are, what they're going to do with your data. And we got to the topic of trust, right? One of the things that financial institutions do have is a lot of trust. And what some of the new fintechs don't have, at least for a certain part of the population, is the trust of the individual users. How can open banking, not even the regulations, but technology solutions, all of these solutions help to generate the trust so that people aren't, worried about their, not only their data disappearing, but also their assets?
Yeah, look, I'll weigh in quicker than others. I mean, if you actually look back in the banking legislation, and I'm sure the Senator will back me up on this, the banks had to be legislated in a large way and have privacy policy brought forward in order to prevent them. They were taking information from Visa applications and using it to pre-approve mortgages. They were then using it to figure out your net worth and calling you on wealth management, right? Until the privacy legislation started to come in. So again, it kind of comes back to why we need to accelerate for open banking the appropriate digital privacy legislation, so that Canada has a robust framework for the fintechs to then grow up within, and the obviously from an open banking standpoint to deal with internationally as well. So my view is this is easy to do. We've done it for the big five. Now we just have to take a fintech tilt and get it in a true open banking context to be able to go beyond our border and allow for that regulated data share within a robust framework. So that's just quick perspective for me.
I'm going to offer a comment you don't hear often from industry. We want more regulation. And this isn't just about open banking, and I'll go back to that in a second, but the payments charter we mentioned was in the budget last month. That's good for Canada. Now Canadian consumers, to your question, will have more safeguards and trust in the payments ecosystem. We will be registered. We will have increased supervision. That is good. That's good for our customers, our partners, and for the Canadian ecosystem. Open banking, similarly, there will be some sort of accreditation regime, certification in place, similar to what's in the UK. And that'll put in place exactly what can and can't be shared, how I can allow that or pull that data back. That is all good. That gives me more control over my data, and it gives me that security to know that the people holding my data are regulated. So again, industry asking for more regulation here.
I think that's right, Nick. I would agree with you for two reasons. One is that if there are bad actors, I think other fintech companies get lumped in. So you need a way of distinguishing between the people who are doing the right thing and protecting the assets that they have versus the ones that aren't. I think secondly, with the lack of regulation, and this is what we found, like what you end up doing, you spend a lot of money on lawyers. And because there are no clear rules, so you're not exactly sure what you can and can't do. So one of the things that we share is that to get Portable started, we spent more on legal fees than on technology because we didn't know what we could and couldn't do. So it was like we didn't want to launch anything, and to get investors on board, they wanted to make sure that what we were doing was legal. And of course, there's like no clear law around that. You just have to sort of get an opinion, which lawyers are only going to give you if you pay for it.
Well,
Ryan, can I just offer one other thought, and that's that regulation is central. I mean, I have a number of friends in the States who are Republican, and they'll always say, regulation's bad. I want less regulation. And I'd say, okay, so you're an NFL fan. Are you going to go to a game with no regulation, no rules, and no enforcement of those rules? No, you're not going to do that. You're not going to enjoy it. What we need is regulation that's not incredibly burdensome. And when you got regulatory change, it's an opportunity to make your economy more efficient. And right now we have an opportunity to make our financial system far more efficient by updating regulations in a way that doesn't have, I mean, I'll give you one example, FinTrack. We've got a huge issue with money laundering in the world. Right now, our anti-money laundering activities are 99.8% successful for criminals. We capture 0.2% of criminal money flows in the world, estimated through our existing AML activities. It's not working, but that's a huge burden on our financial institutions that they've got to go through all these steps to follow the AML guidelines. Well, why don't we turn that on its head and create a globally competitive anti-money laundering industry in Canada of RegTechs that are helping the Canadian government and Canadians and our financial institutions and our fintechs make sure that we're not letting criminals transfer money easily through Canada. That fits our brand as a country. That is a huge economic opportunity. If you consider Verifin as an example in St. John's, Newfoundland, created a $3.6 billion exit in about 14 years in St. John's, not known as a fintech capital of the world, St. John's, Newfoundland. And, phenomenal company focused on anti-fraud and anti-money laundering. So, this is an opportunity for Canada to use regulation as a way to stimulate growth, to establish really good global standards that really move the needle and build off of our banks that are very stable, but not enabling them to become much more competitive and get a lower lower regulatory burden, but not any less effective regulation, probably more effective.
And look, coming back to a bit of what Eva was saying and Nick was saying, I think when you saw the Retail Payment Activity Act being passed, that was a great example too, right, of the legislation modernizing, but also you saw the group behind it, right, was the fintechs, right? Like it was fintech organizations that were pushing for this to provide legitimacy, provide access, to provide credibility to go to the end consumer. And I saw one of the comments in chat about, for the end consumer, it is that peace of mind, right? It is that trust. It is that, factor that there is Canadians to some degree, I think this was Eva's remark about Big Five, they like a bit of regulation, right? Like it's that comfort and peace of mind. But, Nick, I'll throw this maybe over to you because, last time we were talking, right, you were talking about that going through, that legislation going through and the Bank of Canada passing it. I mean, what did it mean to you, from that happening?
Yeah, it was massive. And there's some parallels to draw to this open banking discussion as well in terms of perhaps how it happened. There were rumors it perhaps was not initially included in the budget in the first draft of it. It was in the final draft. I don't know what happened behind the scenes exactly, but what I saw was a lot of players and stakeholders that cared about this pushing for it. And this isn't all just industry either. A lot of others in the payment ecosystem that have worked on it for years, we're reaching out, we're writing letters of support, we're in constant communication. Maybe there's a little bit of a political incentive there as well that helps in these types of things. I worked on the Senate Banking Committee in the US for a long time. And, that when you realize a lot of stakeholders care and they're laying out the reasons why it's good public policy, that can help something that's on the fence move. So hopefully with open banking, we can help make that happen by raising the profile and telling the good story and demonstrating all the benefits. So for us as a company, as I said earlier, it demonstrates to our partners and customers that they can have trust in the payments ecosystem, and they understand there's a level of regulation. To Eva's point, it's not about us. We are already subject to global regulatory standards that we apply across our whole company, but there could be some bad actors that'll have safeguards in place, and that will prevent all of us from being brought down with it.
Great. I'm going to paraphrase a question that we have in the Q&A, or let's say rephrase the question. So thinking about what we can do, right? Thinking of the positives, what do we need in order to get a made in Canada solution moving forward, and to not be regulation takers, but be regulation makers and the innovators, and be seen as the ones that are driving innovation in open banking, in payments? What do we need to do in terms of next steps?
I'll dive in and just say that get together. I worry about a fragmented solution where we have 4 or 5 different approaches, 4 or 5 different APIs that mean that we don't really have an integrated system in terms of connecting banks with fintechs. I really hope that there is effort to build standards that are across the industry, and we can all sort of start to agree and coalesce and iterate from a starting point. We don't need to be perfect, but we need to get started. And I look at how quickly we can move, and look at Brazil. In 1 year, Brazil went from not even thinking about this issue to being having an open banking regulatory framework in place. We can move quickly, but it requires people to get together on the same page. And I think a unifying of effort, from my personal standpoint, around accreditation of organizations and how that accreditation is handled, around how liability is managed for consumers, just basics, where let's have one approach, let's see how it's working, and let's really work together to keep iterating on it to make sure that, because I think this is a great opportunity for our banks. They've got to move from a moat-based system where they're trying to have wider and deeper moats to ecosystems of fintechs that are bringing greater and greater services to their customers, so that their customers remain sticky into the future as they are today, and getting more and more value by continuing to deal with that bank. But the bank is partnering with many fintechs to enable that to happen very safely and deliver great value. That would be my focus.
Great. Anyone else? I'm sure everyone's got an opinion on this.
Agree with everything the senator said. And I'll just add, though, we really do need to help Ottawa understand it a little bit more. The positive is now we're seeing examples. I think, Nick and Eva were giving different examples from around the world. So it's becoming real. They can actually see the practical side. But Ryan, just like you were asking us, the question of, so how do I explain this to my mother? How do I, explain this to someone? It's helping Ottawa truly understand it, right? And that's the party that's in power, that's the official opposition, that's the backbenchers, right? It's how do we get them to really understand it, and how do we get the civil servants, which are below and helping to draft the policy and the agenda, how do we get them to understand it? The more we can give this flesh on the bones and allow people to get it, it then becomes a lot easier for Ottawa to work its magic and to make it a reality. And so it is really important, to have Senator Deakin here, right? And to look and say, how do you start to have people from different parties? Because having the different parties in there will create that catalyst, right? Especially coming up potentially in an election year. So the more we can make this a campaign component, create a movement that is really going out to all of the MPs and educating them on it in our constituencies, that's how we're going to get there on this.
Nick, Eva, want to jump in? If not, I can.
Yeah, I agree. It's education and grassroots support and raising the profile and telling a good story. That's how we do it.
Great. So I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I'm gonna amalgamate them into one. But sort of, Senator Deakin, you mentioned APIs. People are worried about data portability, privacy. And you also talked about a splintered solution, right? We have multiple APIs, but also multiple repositories and sources of the data. One thing we haven't really talked about is I would call the sort of looming specter of big tech, right? So large technology firms, but also firms that run the platforms that a lot of people run small and medium-sized businesses on also happen to have a whole lot of data and a vested interest in becoming the new incumbents like financial institutions. So how is, let's say, a combination of regulation, technology, and innovation, how are we going to, I don't want to say fight against that, but partner with these organizations? How does this fit into the mix? I know that was a big question, but I think it's an important one.
Consumers are increasingly mobile. And we've digitized at a rate of probably a month a year over the course of a year for every month of the COVID pandemic, I should say. So there's no holding back. There's no finger in the dike of this challenge for those who don't want to move. It's happening, and if we do not move swiftly, the ability for Canada to control how services what services are available and regulate the services that are available will diminish over time, because look where we're at with big tech, and the global wars going over just having a standard digital services tax put in place. Like that became a real battle with the US and Europe last year, certainly well publicized battle with Australia and Facebook. We cannot ignore the reality of where consumers are moving, and especially younger and younger consumers. And so we've got to make sure that Canada is positioned to compete against big tech and not try and preserve a past that is increasingly increasingly uncompetitive in terms of the value that consumers get relative to the services they're receiving, and paying for. They're just not getting the services they could be receiving through a competitor. They're just not getting what they need. And so that's my big worry, is that Canada's got to figure out where our industries are going to be able to compete to keep control of the Canadian sovereignty, Canadian identity, Canadian opportunities, Canadian jobs, Canadian prosperity. And that comes through being a global standard setter, not a global standard taker. Agreed.
And I should have mentioned at the start that probably the largest fintechs in the world are e-commerce platforms, right? And not particularly in Canada, but elsewhere. And these new initiatives like Facebook's Libra or now Diem to create their own method of payment as well is certainly something that's coming in. Nick, Rob, Eva, anything you wanted to say to that? And if not, I could probably go into maybe letting everyone get some comments. Nick, looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, just echoing, there's an opportunity here for Canada to go from a laggard to a leader, where we're London-based company, but we partner with banks and businesses. And Rob and Eva will surely get outreach from me in the coming weeks about discussions. And that's because we want to help grow those Canadian businesses so they can be successful. And that's why it's essential we move to help build that Canadian fintech ecosystem before others come in and take it over.
Yeah, look, just adding in, I mean, there is a real movement out there in the Canadian space. We just have to stand up in an organized way. Look, I run a credit union, Alternative Savings. We're one of, 231, financial institutions across the country in every province, rural, urban. We're kind of the heartland of Canada in many respects. We have just a desire to partner with every and all fintechs, right? Like every credit union that's out there realizes we are better together truly, and we are brighter together, and so I have to tell you, there is a strong movement in the cooperative space to help enable fintechs, partner with fintechs. And, I ask you all in the space to think about credit unions as a way, because we are regulated. We can help you on the regulation side and understand it. we're not going to want to own you. We're not going to want you to only deal with us. We're going to let you go and flourish, because our view is we want you to be bigger, be bolder, and we'll help enable you, right? Because that's what we're trying to do, help our communities, help the country. So, I just want to put that thought bubble out there, in this, because, there is a movement there, and credit unions, it's quite funny. The first, you love your remote deposit capture of a check. That was developed by a credit union first. There are tons of firsts that come out of small institutions that are then taken up into the big institutions. So that's my, Ryan, that's my 60-second spot for the credit union movement.
Thanks. Everyone's allowed to talk their book at least, at least 1 minute. So we've got 5 minutes left. I want to be a good manager of time and give everyone a last chance to, like Rob, to say their piece. Although I'll still give you a last shot. And I'm going to weave in one request to the sort of your final words. We got a question about. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the question is, how can I, in quotation marks, help to push further or take action towards open banking? So how can someone personally and actionably affect this? And so if you guys could, I think in your last 30 seconds before we wrap it up and I send everyone home, you could touch on that, would be great. And maybe we'll just do it in order of how I have people in Zoom. So it's Senator Deakin, Nick, Rob, Eva, you'll get the final word. Senator Deakin.
I'm very glad Eva gets the final word. She's in the trenches, and great to see that. For me, write your MP, write the Minister of Finance, engage your elected parliamentarians. Right now, it's crucial that Canada start to catch up to the rest of the world in the digital economy. We need digital legislative and regulatory infrastructure in this country very, very badly. And we're not keeping up on that front. And the only way we can start to change that is to move our political parties to the point that they realize they've got to work together on this for the benefit of all Canadians. They've got to prioritize this for the benefit of all Canadians. The Senate is seeing single sports betting legislation coming next week. We are not seeing new privacy legislation coming next week. That is a real disappointment from my standpoint.
Yeah, the answer is do what Senator Deakin says. He certainly knows best, but that's right. There's the famous campaign in the 80s. I want my MTV. Call your cable company. Tell me you want your MTV. That's how politics works sometimes. Good policy also needs good politics. So let's help create those good politics. Engage in the political process. Help educate your MPs and help raise the profile of this and tell a positive story, and that's how we'll be successful.
Yep, I'm going to sound like a third wheel. I mean, it's, first educate yourself, right? Find out the context, get the knowledge base in, and then do the outreach. Hit your MPP, your MP, and get ready for the election. And when you see the signs go up in the neighborhood of all the parties, get a quality communication out to all of those party members so that it's part of the debate in the local community. It's part of the debate, when it goes up into the election process. Get it in part of the dialogue. Use your social media channels, right, to message to the candidates, to message to the people that are in office. Educate and outreach, and engage the biggest things.
I'll say something maybe a little bit different. I would agree with everything that's been said so far, but I think part of educating yourself is use a fintech company, right? Like disrupt the status quo, which is, I think as Canadians, we're so used to the inertia of it's like, we'd love to complain about things, but we maybe don't actually do anything. So I think one of the greatest ways to educate yourself is obviously start with Borrowell, but there's a ton of amazing fintech companies. Next, go to Wise, and then just use it and understand what people are talking about. I think there's no better way to be an evangelist than to love a product and say you want more of this.
3 cheers for Eva.
And we don't want to leave Rob out. Open an account with a credit union. That's the third in the Holy Trinity.
It just feels good. It will feel good. Okay.
Get that dopamine bump.
Well done. Well done.
Great. So I would like to, we've got exactly 1 minute left. I like to keep everything on time, also because I've told my house what my schedule is. So I'm sure that they'll be waiting for me, as will all of your loved ones. It's been a great panel. I learned a lot. I really appreciated having all of our panelists, Senator Deakin, Nick, Rob, Eva. It's been great. Kara as well, I should mention, for doing all of the organizing, getting us together, keeping me on track, sending me the details as I need them. I should also give a shout out to, speaking of making the changes, we launched, and I'm going to talk my book now for a second, the first FinTech Masters in Canada, the Masters of Financial Innovation and Technology. We have a large number, I was looking through the participants list, of our inaugural class that have attended today. Next week or the following week, they're actually taking a course on Banking Disrupted. Notice my colleague Lynette Purda is also there. She'll be teaching the course. So if you have more questions about open banking and none of our esteemed panelists are there to answer the call, I would be happy to, and so would a lot of our students. They'll be graduating in October, November. So remember to keep them in mind. And with that, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great session.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. You did a great job.
Great job.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Great. I learned a lot. Thanks, everyone.